gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Dennis from Submission Radio, ladies and gentlemen, hanging out with you here at the Sphere, getting ready for UFC 400, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen. Dennis from Down Under, ladies and gentlemen. The greatest media guy hanging out here, ladies and gentlemen. We got the color yellow, baby. Double eye emoji, ladies and gentlemen. Double eye emoji. Look at that double eye emoji, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, this could be the greatest MMA media report you've ever seen, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, I was going to have Simon Feck on the show, ladies and gentlemen. And I told Simon Feck, I'll be coming on your show because I'm Dennis, the nicest guy in MMA media, ladies and gentlemen. But I turned Simon Feck down because you know why? Simon Feck doesn't hang out like me. Simon Feck sucks balls, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen. Waiting for UFC 400, ladies and gentlemen. You're getting the media coverage here before anybody else, ladies and gentlemen. Let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. UFC 400, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be one of the greatest sports events of all time, ladies and gentlemen. We got Randy Couture versus Chuck Liddell 4, ladies and gentlemen. That's what I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen. Denis Shkuratov here, ladies and gentlemen. Hanging out with you here, ladies and gentlemen, in Las Vegas. Los Angeles, ladies and gentlemen. Well, we could be in Las Vegas, I don't know. Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, we got people in chat going on here, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just Dennis. Dennis from Submission Radio from Down Under, ladies and gentlemen, right here. Las Vegas, Nevada, ladies and gentlemen. We got a #1 fan in here, ladies and gentlemen. #1's taking over #1, ladies and gentlemen. We got people here watching Dennis live, ladies and gentlemen. I'm like one of the greatest MMA media guys of all time. Now watch this. Watch these people walk right in front of the camera, ladies and gentlemen. There they go. Look at those good-looking specimens there. Oh, the camera almost fell down, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, we got some other good... Check these ladies out, ladies and gentlemen. They're walking in front of the camera, ladies and gentlemen. It is a public sidewalk, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be the fight companion of the month here, ladies and gentlemen. Dennis from Submission Radio, ladies and gentlemen. Simon Feck couldn't make it, ladies and gentlemen, because Simon Feck's a cock, ladies and gentlemen. Too bad we can't read the quotes in here, ladies and gentlemen. Why does he keep saying ladies and gentlemen all the time? Let's see. Let's see if we can read the chat, ladies and gentlemen. We got double eye emoji in here, ladies and gentlemen. From Big Bert's MMA, ladies and gentlemen. We got Dylan in here saying hi. Some of the greatest footage you'll ever see. Nobody's getting this, ladies and gentlemen. Nobody's bringing you content like this, ladies and gentlemen. MMA hurt you. That's what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen. We're looking at too high in here, ladies and gentlemen. The Sphere. That's right. Got the Sphere. I'm ducking hating you. You got Denis here. Denis hanging out. I'm Denis Shkuratov, the greatest MMA journalist of all time, ladies and gentlemen. I screwed over Simon Feck, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, let's see what we got. We got Dylan. Hey, listen, Dylan, I don't know. We're just mainly getting footage here. Denis, Dylan, I'm Denis, ladies and gentlemen. Check it out, ladies and gentlemen. We're looking at 12 high here, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Denis Shkuratov from Submission Radio, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to tell you right now, Moss from the MMA Holes, he likes Simon Feck, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not ever going to talk to Moss from the MMA Holes, ladies and gentlemen. I'm never going to talk to him again, ladies and gentlemen. It's weird. 2GP. You know what's weird? You know what's weird? Your name, too. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Why does Denis keep saying ladies and gentlemen? You know what I'm saying? 2GP. What does 2GP mean, ladies and gentlemen? Huh? Ha ha. Ladies and gentlemen, we're sitting at 19 high, ladies and gentlemen. 19 high, ladies and gentlemen. The Wizard of Oz, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, the wizard is just a man behind the curtain, ladies and gentlemen. We're getting ready to get some action here, ladies and gentlemen. We got people walking down the sidewalk, ladies and gentlemen. Look at that, right there. Look at that. Denis is hanging out with the common folk, ladies and gentlemen. You know why? Because I act like I'm the common guy, but I'm actually Denis Shkuratov, the biggest cock on the planet, ladies and gentlemen. Look at the Sphere. The Sphere stole my colors, ladies and gentlemen. The Sphere stole my colors. Look at that, ladies and gentlemen. Anybody can hide, ladies and gentlemen. Anybody can hide, but you can always be found, ladies and gentlemen. Remember that. You can always be found, ladies and gentlemen. We're talking the Sphere during the day. Look at that. You got advertisements on the outside of it. People come here to look at this thing, and it's nothing but a big, shitty-ass commercial, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm Denis Shkuratov from Submission Radio from Down Under, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, I used to think I'm something special. I'm an MMA guy from Australia. But guess what? Simon Feck has an Australian guy. He's got an Aussie. Anybody could become an Australian. You just move there. That's all you got to do. You just move there. You get on an airplane and you're in a boat or something and you get there and you're Australian, ladies and gentlemen. That's what I'm telling you right now, ladies and gentlemen. 22 high, ladies and gentlemen. 22 high. We got people in the chat, ladies and gentlemen. We got people in the chat. We're just hanging out with a big nacho cheese commercial, ladies and gentlemen. Nacho cheese. You know, like Demetrius. Like Demetrius, ladies and gentlemen. I'm telling you right now, the MMA Guru doesn't bring you content like this, ladies and gentlemen. We're sitting at an even 17 viewers concurrently, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Denis Shkuratov, and I'm the yellow guy. I stole it from Kevin Iole, ladies and gentlemen. Kevin Iole, the 65-year-old MMA guy, has been there forever, ladies and gentlemen. He's 3 times the age of the average fighter on the roster of the UFC, ladies and gentlemen. Kevin Iole, that's right. John Morgan. John Morgan's never put out content like this, ladies and gentlemen. Look at you. Look at you. The Backstreet Boys. Simon Feck was hanging out with the Backstreet Boys 2 nights ago, ladies and gentlemen. 2 nights ago, Simon Feck hanging out with the Backstreet Boys at the barber shop, ladies and gentlemen, in Las Vegas, Nevada, ladies and gentlemen. Getting ready here. The first reporter on the scene for UFC 400, ladies and gentlemen. That's what I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, we're sitting at 20 high, ladies and gentlemen. Imagine people are actually watching me out here, too, like that guy. I got people behind me watching me, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just Dennis here, hanging out at the Sphere, ladies and gentlemen. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Whoops, ladies and gentlemen. There's people in here, but nobody's typing in, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Denis Shkuratov from Submission Radio, ladies and gentlemen. I'm bringing you content that nobody has ever brought before, ladies and gentlemen. Look at this content here, ladies and gentlemen. You can either say we're late for UFC 300 or we're early for UFC 400, ladies and gentlemen. And just because I'm on the Simon Feck network, I don't have to keep saying ladies and gentlemen. Look at that, another commercial. You just come here and you look at the Sphere and it's nothing but commercials, ladies and gentlemen. Look at that, get your tickets at the Sphere. I mean, who wouldn't think that you could get a ticket at the Sphere? What do you think you're gonna get? Tickets for Allegiant Stadium at the Sphere? I mean, come on, ladies and gentlemen. Here comes a couple tourists, ladies and gentlemen. We're sitting at 30 high, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, look at that. They're on the show for free, ladies and gentlemen. Look at that. Looking at me, Denis Shkuratov, the greatest MMA reporter, ladies and gentlemen. I tell Simon Feck I'm going to go on the Simon Feck show for like 2 or 3 weeks, like 10 different times. I tell Simon Feck, I'm going on the Simon Feck show. Yeah, I'm coming on. 2 days before he goes on the Simon Feck show, I, Denis Shkuratov, cancels on Simon Feck 1 foot cock, ladies and gentlemen. Ha ha! We got some more people coming, ladies and gentlemen. This guy looks like an MMA fighter. He looks like an MMA fighter, ladies and gentlemen. Look at that man. Look at that man right there, ladies and gentlemen. That man right there, that's not a guy to mess around with right there, ladies and gentlemen. Man, it's weird that like nobody pays attention to me. I'm just a big bird out here, ladies and gentlemen, in a costume, ladies and gentlemen. We're sitting at 14, 16 high, ladies and gentlemen. 16 concurrent viewers looking at this great content here. Denis, the greatest interviewer of all MMA fighters, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Denis Shkuratov. I'm even better than Moss from the MMA holds, ladies and gentlemen. You know what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen? I mean, you're sitting at home, ladies and gentlemen, sitting on the couch, ladies and gentlemen, sitting here watching Denis Shkuratov from Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, look at that, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, we got action here, ladies and gentlemen. People walking by, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, the Las Vegas tourism is down 42%, ladies and gentlemen. But the Simon Feck show is now. The Simon Feck show is getting at least 42 views per video, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going down. I'm Denis Shkuratov from Submission Radio, ladies and gentlemen. And let me tell you something. I'm jealous because Moss from the Gummy Gang, ladies and gentlemen, Moss from the Gummy Gang likes Simon Feck. I hate Simon Feck. I think Simon Feck is a big cock, ladies and gentlemen. And by the way, why do they call Simon Feck 1 foot cock, ladies and gentlemen? I don't know. It's like you look at him, he looks like a big bird. He looks like a bird. And then they call him 1 foot cock, ladies and gentlemen. And does he have 1 foot? I have no idea, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just a journalist from down under. I thought I was unique, but Simon Feck has an Aussie on his show, ladies and gentlemen. It's something else, ladies and gentlemen. Now just imagine what your day is all about, ladies and gentlemen. You're sitting here watching Denis Shkuratov hanging out at the Sphere, ladies and gentlemen. Bringing up the greatest content of all time, ladies and gentlemen. There's the MMA holes, ladies and gentlemen. The MMA holes, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, I'm Denis Shkuratov. Moss, I heard Simon Feck's trying to get a hold of you. You know, he wants to share some of that Apex access, ladies and gentlemen, with the MMA holes, ladies and gentlemen. Simon Feck's out having fun with rock and roll bands and everything like that. Simon Feck is a freaking celebrity, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Denis Shkuratov filling in for Simon Feck, the 1 foot cock, ladies and gentlemen, with the double eye emojis. Why would you come in and do double eye emojis, ladies and gentlemen? It doesn't make a bit of sense. Ladies and gentlemen, we got a fighter here. It could be Rocky, ladies and gentlemen. It looks like it could be Rocky, ladies and gentlemen. There he is. He's a big, bad dude, ladies and gentlemen. He's nobody to mess around with, ladies and gentlemen. Simon Feck's my camera guy. It's only the two of us. I don't know, that guy. There comes a race guy. Whoa! Ladies and gentlemen. All right, ladies and gentlemen. That's it. Ladies and gentlemen, we gotta go and hang out with rock stars and stuff, ladies and gentlemen.